Hello, and welcome to the Embarcadero University course, Data Modeling with ER Studio. In this session, we'll talk about using the data dictionary. We'll discuss how to set up and use domains. We'll also discuss how to set up and use attachments to define your own pieces of metadata assigned to objects. We'll talk about how to set up and use reference values that can be used to document allowed values. We'll show you how to define and leverage naming standards. And lastly, we'll show you how to promote existing objects to an enterprise data dictionary so they can be shared across all your models in the repository. Okay, let's start this session by going through the use of domains. I'll go over to the Data Dictionary tab, and under this Domains folder is where you'll be able to define and use the domains. You'll notice a number of things. You can create folders to group domains. You can also create subdomains in a hierarchy of domains. Now, if we make a change to description, those changes will inherit and move and propagate down to long description. If I double click and go into long description, there's ways that you can actually control that. If you check this option here, receive parent modifications, then the properties will propagate down as long as the properties are the same as the parent domain. So any properties in this long description that are the same as description will be propagated if I update description. If I want to create a new domain, and when you're thinking about domains, there's a lot of ways that you can structure them. But if you're going to reuse an attribute or a column more than once, it's a good idea to create a domain. So say we want, under the person, place, or thing, we want to create a domain email address. That's something we may use in the client, in the broker, and in future tables or entities. So I'll just right-click, create new domain, and we'll call this email address. If you want to just use the same attribute and column name, you can do that. You can also edit these here if we want to actually put maybe an underscore in between, and then we can pick a data type. So in this case, we may want it to be varchar, and we'll make it 255. And then you can decide on some of these other properties as well. Now, when we define these properties and then use it on an attribute, and I update the domain, it will propagate down to the attributes or columns that use that domain. So I can hit OK, and you'll see nested underneath the person, place, or thing group, we have email address. Now, if I wanted to use that, I can just simply grab that and drag and drop it over to our client entity. If I want to rename it after we've used it, that's perfectly fine. I can even just hit Control-Shift, and maybe we want to prefix this with client email address. And you'll see here, since this display is actually using the domain, we'll see what it's bound to. If I go into the properties of client, we'll see for email address that it actually used that data type that we wanted to. In the future, if we decide that email address should be varchar 500, I can make a change here, hit OK, and then if I go back into the client entity, we'll see that email address was changed to varchar 500. So this is a great way to keep common data elements in sync with each other so that you don't have the same data defined differently in two different places. If you want to see where a domain is bound, you can just simply right-click, go to View Domain Bindings, and you'll notice that we'll see that it's in the client entity in the logical model, and it's on the client email address column. And you'll see multiple entries here if it's in multiple places. Now, once you've used a domain, there are cases where you may want to override the values. So there are cases, obviously, for legacy purposes where you want to have email addresses all to be varchar 500, but you may have some email columns in production that are 255. And if that's the case, we can actually override the domain values by just checking this option here and selecting 255. Now, when you can also bind a domain to an existing column, and in that case, you have the option to keep the attribute properties. So I'll hit OK, and that data type will be separated from the domain. And if I make a change to the domain, it will not affect that email address in the client entity. So that's just a very quick overview of domains. Later in the session, we'll talk about enterprise domains. Let's move on and discuss attachments. If we scroll up to the top of the data dictionary, we'll see the attachments node. And simply, the attachments are a way that you can create custom properties that you want to assign to any object in the meta model. So if you notice here, we might have this entity and tables properties folder. And under that, we have business unit, data quality steward, and design steward. So these might be properties that we want to assign to entities in our logical model. If we open up the attachment type folder, I'll see the usage. And since we've just checked entity and table, these objects here, or these attachments underneath, will only be valid for entities. If we wanted to use this business unit, data quality steward, and design steward on any other objects, I can select them here. So I can just select these, then we'll be able to use them on submodels, on attributes, columns, views, so on and so forth. Now if we want to create our own attachment, I can just right click, create new attachment, and maybe we'll call this governance maturity level. So we'll give it a name. And then under the value, we'll be able to pick a data type for this piece of information. Now, you can do a lot of things here. We can have it as just simple text. That would be free text by the that you would put in yourself. No formatting or anything like that. We could create a text list. We can make this a time or a date. We can make it a Boolean value. We can make it a numeric value. We can also reference an external file. So if we make an external file, that would allow us to link to web pages, as well as Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PDF files, any file that might have further documentation. In this case, we'll choose text list, and we'll just give some values here. We'll say ungoverned. We'll make one as draft. We'll make another as approved. You may want other values here. You can create as many as you want. The checkbox means that this is the default. Under the binding information is where we can actually decide where to put this piece of information. So if I want to assign it to all of our entities or tables, I can click that, and then you'll see here we have the logical model list of objects, we have the gim_dw list of tables, and we have the gim__oltp list of tables. So in this case, I can just hit select all, and now all these would basically receive the default value of ungoverned for this piece of information. If we wanted to change the value, I can just simply double click and we'll set the value override to say that maybe this broker is in draft and maybe the client entity here has been approved. So you can go through and set these levels through this interface right here. What you can also do, if we go over to the client entity and I go to attachment bindings, you can see here we have all these other values listed here. And maybe there was one that we don't have listed yet, and we want to say, who has data access to this. Well, it's the internal BI unit, and I'll move that there. So what I can do now is, if I wanted to document the business unit, I can just simply double click, and I'll type this in. Maybe for this it's client services, and I'll hit OK, and that value will be assigned there. Now what you can also do, and this could be a value as well, is actually display the current entity attachments on the diagram. So if I go to our display options and I go into the entity tab, I can just check this option here that would basically show the attachments and their values, and I'll hit OK. And let's use a layout here, and I'll zoom back in, and you can see here for the client entity that I have a list of the attributes and then a list of all the attachments and their values. And you can see some are blank, but you can see that the business unit for this is client services, and the maturity level here is set to approved. Now we can also search for these values if we go to our tools menu and go to the universal naming utility, and maybe I want to see everywhere we have a draft value. I can just simply type that in, hit search, and then you'll see anywhere we have that. So we have that on broker, and you can see it's in the logical model, and then you'd even be able to see any usage here that would be submodel usage within those models. So you get a look at the where used as well. So that's some nice functionality in terms of actually setting up these values and then being able to isolate information very quickly. One of the other things that we have that is related to the attachments is this data security information. If I right click here and generate the defaults, we actually will pre-install these three tags for you. So you have a compliance mapping that would have a set of values, you have a privacy level, and you have a security impact. So if we go through and we set up everywhere we have a security or privacy level of regulated customer information, then we can go and search on that and find those values very easily. The data security information would work the exact same as the attachments. Alright, now let's move on to reference values. Reference values are a great way to set up allowed values for domains or attributes or columns. You can see here I have two reference values defined in this data dictionary. I have state codes, which would document both the value and the value description for the 50 states. Then I have days of the week that are going to show the value there, as well as the value description. Now, say I want to use this state code on a particular column or attribute. And you can see here we have a client state province, and what I can do is a number of things. I can actually, you can see here that that client state province actually has a domain, and that's used down below here, as defined here. So I can actually leverage that reference value to generate a constraint. And if I want to, I can just use our constraint generator. I'll just simply right click and run. And here we have the option of looking at bound columns of this, and we don't have any yet. Or we can look at bound domains, or just look at domains versus all attributes. So in this particular macro, we'll look at the domains, and then what I want to do is actually bind it or define a constraint on this particular state code domain. So we'll apply the column and we'll say apply. So what that's going to do is put this constraint on that domain for me. And if we go back and go over to the domain, we can see now that we have that constraint here. We can also, if we wanted to, we can just simply go to the reference values tab and then select, and then it would document, and this would show up in all the metadata that this domain has these values. And that will propagate down to the attributes as well. So what we've done, if we go to the client entity here and go to state province, we'll now see under the rule that we have that reference value defined, where basically you can, we've defined it on the domain, and it went through the domain down to each attribute and column that we're using that state code domain. So there's a way that you can use all these in combination with each other. Now whenever we use that state code domain, we'll have the reference values along with us and the constraint as well. And you can see here, if we go to reference values, that propagated as well. Let's move on to the naming standards. When we talk about naming standards, most of the time it's about translating logical business names to short, truncated technical names in the physical model. So let's go down to the physical model, and we'll take a look at this GIM OLTP model. And if I zoom in here, you'll see that none of these have really been truncated or abbreviated. We're just capitalizing, and we have an underscore in between this, instead of the spaces here. But say we're worried about some of these names getting too long, and for Oracle, limiting to 30 characters, that could be a problem. So what I can do, if I go back to the data dictionary, I'll go to this abbreviation list dictionary, and what this is going to show me, or allow me to do, is set up a logical standard here, so how I want the logical names to be. And you can see here we have entity names set to uppercase, attributes to upper camel, and then we have the physical, which is everything's getting converted to uppercase. Under the mapping tab is where we can define abbreviations. So you have the logical token and then the physical abbreviation. And then you can qualify what you want that token to be. A class word like an ID, a document, a name, text, date, that type of thing. Qualifier would then be similar to adding qualifiers on the name that would, first name, last name, middle name, anything that might be, that's going to qualify that class word. And then the prime that could be, customer, employee, vendor, that would then set up the primary use for that. So, and then under the general tab is where we'd be able to set up any word separation on the physical side as well as the logical side. And what you can notice here on the logical side is we actually have a space typed in there. You can also, if words are separated by case, you can do that as well. Under the order tab, this would allow you to then choose the ordering. And by default, we just order it prime, qualifier, class. You can switch that around if you want. You'll note under the mapping tab and abbreviations, you can actually import as well, and you can import from a CSV, and if you just have the columns set up like they are here, then they will come in accordingly. And if you export, you'll see the format. The priority, if we have duplicates, so say you have two, like accounts, an accountant, an account, all go to ACCT as the physical abbreviation. Well, if you're going from physical to logical, you need to set up a priority there. The primary one will get used. So after you have it set up, that's when you can use it with the naming standard utility. We'll go to Model, Naming Standard Utility, and in this case, under the options, I'll select the abbreviation list, and then in this case, we want to actually use the logical names and truncate and abbreviate the physical names. Now we can go to the output and run a translation. And you just have to select all here. So if I run that, you'll see here that it'll abbreviate all the logical names and then use these to this physical name. If I hit OK, it's then going to commit it to the model. So you can see here the abbreviation was done. And what you'll notice that ER Studio does, if we go to the Columns tab here, we actually display or store both the entity, the business name, and the physical table name in the editor here. We do that for each column as well, and that's what we're actually searching for when we do that abbreviation. We're using the attribute name and then replacing the column name, and that's what we did there. So that's basically it for naming standards. You can use the naming standard file as you're generating a physical model. You can also use the abbreviation file as you're reverse engineering and you want to take the short truncated names and replace them with business names. The last thing we will discuss here is the Enterprise Data Dictionary system. If we go up to the repository, I can add this model that we have to the repository. When I do that, I'll get prompted with an interface to set up the properties here. And what I can do is take that local data dictionary and actually promote that local to an enterprise data dictionary. What this will allow me to do is then use that data dictionary and share that data dictionary among other diagrams in the repository. We've already done that, so what I'll do is go to the repository and retrieve a model from the repository. In this case, I'll select the GIMDB, and this will open it for me. Now we'll be talking about the repository in another session, but real quick, you'll see if I go to the Data Dictionary tab that we now have this core components data dictionary. And this data dictionary is leveraged across many different diagrams in the repository. You'll notice that I don't have any local domains. That's because when this model was added to the repository, the local was promoted to an enterprise data dictionary. The local data dictionary is going to be specific to a DM1, whereas the enterprise would be shareable across any number of diagrams in the repository. You can copy and paste and move domains up to the enterprise. Under the macro list here, under the metadata management, we also have ways to import domains, import reference values, and those macros provide you a way of importing to an enterprise data dictionary. If we go up to the repository menu again and go to the data dictionary menu, we'll actually be able to look at the enterprise data dictionary bindings. So whereas from the local data dictionary we can see where a domain lives across this particular DM1 file, now we can actually see where a particular domain lives across the entire repository. So you can see here this core components data dictionary is used in every model in the repository. This is a list of all of them, and this tells you if it's bound or not. So this data dictionary is bound on every diagram. If we want to take a look at a particular domain, all I have to do is select it. So if we select this identifier domain, this then gives us a list of all the attributes across the entire repository that actually are using that domain. And if I make a change to that domain, it will propagate across all of these diagrams. You can filter this list by going down below here. You can export this to CSV. So this gives you a nice look at some impact analysis. If you're going to make a change to that particular domain, what's going to be affected across the repository. And this gives you a nice report that would show that. So that concludes the session on the Enterprise Data Dictionary and the Data Dictionary as a whole.